There is a truth so simple and yet so often left unspoken. When you truly put God first, not in theory, not in the way you might talk about it to others, but in the deep, practical way you live your actual days, everything in your life begins to change in ways you never could have predicted. And here's the remarkable part. Those changes don't arrive because you suddenly became more disciplined or because you tried harder to be spiritual. They happen because the order of your heart has shifted. In that surrender, God begins to move, not as a distant idea, but as a living presence, shaping the core of who you are. Over the years, I've sat with countless people, good people, whose eyes carried quiet exhaustion and whose words carried questions they could barely form. They tell me they believe in God, they pray regularly, they attend church faithfully, and yet deep inside, they still feel lost, unsettled, and strangely without peace. More than once I've heard them say in a low, almost embarrassed voice, "Why doesn't my Christian life look the way I hoped it would?" When I hear this, I don't rush to answer. Instead, I ask a question that is both simple and piercing. In everything you're doing right now, in your choices, your thoughts, the way you spend your time, the things you guard, the fears you refuse to face, is there anywhere God is truly first? Most of the time, the answer comes in the form of silence, a silence heavy with realization. The truth is, many believers have God somewhere in their lives, but not at the center. They've invited Him into their home, but only into the guest room. He's acknowledged, but not enthroned. He becomes a comforting concept, not the driving force behind their decisions. And when God is in the background rather than at the forefront, something gets blocked, not because He lacks power, but because we've placed Him in a position He never agreed to take. Second, third, or just somewhere among the rest. I don't share this to stir guilt. I share it to extend an invitation. If you've ever wondered why your faith feels stagnant, why your prayers feel mechanical, or why your joy feels fragile, perhaps the missing piece isn't a new spiritual habit or one more inspiring sermon. Maybe what you need is to shift God into His rightful place, not somewhere in your life, but at the very center. When that happens, you will not be the same. So let's begin with what happens first. When God moves from the margins to the center, the first unmistakable change is this: your priorities begin to shift. This shift rarely arrives with loud fanfare. More often, it begins quietly, almost invisibly, in the everyday rhythms of life. You still wake up to the same responsibilities. You still commute to work, answer emails, pay bills, and talk with the same people. Yet, deep beneath the surface, something begins to stir. Your heart starts tugging in new directions. The things that once dominated your energy, status, security, approval, achievement, start loosening their grip on you. You don't suddenly stop caring about them altogether, but they no longer occupy the throne of your heart. Something greater has taken that space, and that something is not a concept. It is a person. I once counseled a woman who had spent decades faithfully serving in her church. She raised her children in the faith, showed up for every need that arose, and quietly carried the burdens of others. And yet one day, with tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks, she admitted, "I've loved God all my life, but I don't think I've ever made Him first. I've always fit Him in around everything else." She wasn't bitter. She wasn't even ashamed. She was simply waking up to a truth that had been waiting patiently in her soul for years. From that day forward, she began to reorder her life, not in one dramatic leap, but in deliberate daily choices. And here's what you must understand. Putting God first doesn't mean quitting your job, giving away all your possessions, or moving to a far-off village. It means that in every situation you ask, what does God value most here? It means allowing His wisdom, not the world's logic, to influence your calendar, your tone of voice, your spending habits, the way you approach rest, and even the things you choose to protect. Time is often the first battleground where this shift plays out. When God takes first place, your view of time changes. You stop seeing it as something you control and start seeing it as something entrusted to you. You feel uneasy about wasting hours on activities that leave your soul empty. You begin to hunger for moments of stillness, not because you want to earn points with God, but because something in you truly needs it, the way a plant needs light. Relationships begin to change, too. You may find yourself gently stepping back from voices that consistently feed your anxiety or distraction, not from pride, but from a deepening awareness that some relationships pull you away from peace rather than toward it. You lose the appetite for constantly proving yourself to people who will never be satisfied. Even conflict looks different. You become slower to defend your ego and quicker to forgive. Your first question in tense moments shifts from, how can I win? To, how can I honor God right now? This doesn't make you passive. It makes you anchored. And even your definition of success undergoes transformation. You still work hard, but your goal changes. Success stops being about visibility and starts being about faithfulness. You measure your days not by how much you accomplished, but by whether you stayed in step with God's Spirit. That alone brings a rest the world can't replicate. Humility begins to take root as you loosen your grip on control. You stop trying to choreograph every detail of your life and start trusting that the one who leads you will also provide for you, protect you, and open the right doors at the right time. Your bills will still come. Hard decisions will still arrive. Disappointments will still sting. But now, you're not deciding from a place of fear, you're deciding from faith. This is the quiet miracle of reordered priorities. You stop asking, what do I want to do? And start asking, what is God already doing and how can I join Him? That question alone will begin to strip away frantic decision-making. You'll find you don't rush as much. You wait better. You listen more deeply. You breathe more fully, not because you mastered life, but because the Master now leads it. That's the first movement of transformation when God truly becomes first. The compass of your life shifts, and as it does, everything else, slowly, surely, begins to follow. The second movement is just as profound. You begin to desire what God desires. At first, your old desires don't vanish overnight. You still long for comfort, security, success, love, and approval. These are deeply human needs, and not all of them are wrong. But as God takes first place, a subtle yet undeniable shift occurs. It's not forced. It doesn't come from guilt or fear. It happens quietly, almost like waking up one day and realizing the foods you used to crave no longer satisfy you. You may find yourself pausing before purchases you would have made without thinking. You might switch off a show you once enjoyed because now it unsettles your spirit. You notice the sheer volume of noise you used to tolerate and how much you now long for stillness. These small sacred turns of the heart matter more than you realize. I once spoke with a woman who said, "I used to pray for a husband, a house, and a better job. But now I just pray to want what God wants, because every time I got what I wanted without Him, it only made me more anxious." Her realization didn't arrive in a single, dramatic moment. It was born from years of chasing personal dreams, then wondering why joy never stayed. She had confused blessings with alignment. Only when she began asking, "God, what do you want here?" did she taste the peace that success had never given her. When you start to desire what God desires, your passions aren't erased, they're refined. You might love music, business, teaching, or writing. None of these callings vanish. Instead, you surrender them to God and ask, "How can this reflect your heart, not just my talent?" Suddenly, your work carries eternal weight. Your reactions shift, too. Gossip loses its appeal. Harsh words trigger a quiet tug in your conscience. You grow softer toward those you once judged harshly. Why? Because you're learning what God values: mercy, justice, humility, truth. And once you begin to see people through His eyes, it's nearly impossible to return to your old way of seeing. When God truly becomes the center of your life, there's a slow but unmistakable reorientation of the heart. It doesn't happen in a flash of light or a single emotional breakthrough, but in the gradual unfolding of countless small moments, each one shifting your affections a little closer to His. Your old desires don't vanish overnight. They linger like echoes of a former life, whispering for your attention in the quiet spaces. Comfort, recognition, financial security, the approval of others. These longings may still rise up from time to time, and not all of them are wrong in themselves. But as you keep returning to God day after day, something begins to change. You start noticing that the things which once gripped you tightly no longer have the same hold. Their pull weakens, and something else, something more lasting, takes their place. You find yourself yearning less for the fleeting satisfaction of personal victories and more for the deep, quiet joy of alignment with His heart. It's not a transformation born of pressure or guilt. No one is standing over you with a checklist of holy desires you're supposed to adopt. Rather, it's a shift that happens almost imperceptibly, as if your soul has been tuning itself to a new frequency without you realizing it. The shows, conversations, and habits that once entertained you start to feel hollow, not because you've suddenly decided they're bad, but because they no longer fill the hunger inside. In their place grows a longing for things that feed your spirit instead of just distracting it. You may begin to notice how much noise you've allowed to surround you: mental noise, emotional noise, spiritual noise, and realize that stillness has become something you crave. It's not an escape from the world, but a deeper engagement with it, because now you want to hear God's whisper before all other voices. I think often of a woman I once met who had spent years praying for the right blessings: a loving marriage, a comfortable home, a career that matched her talents. She was faithful in her requests, pouring her hopes into prayer. But when she finally received many of the things she had longed for, she found herself strangely restless. "Every time I got what I wanted without God's timing or God's leading," she told me, "I ended up more anxious, not less." Over time, she began to pray a very different prayer. Not, "Lord, give me what I want," but, "Lord, teach me to want what you want." That single shift didn't erase her personality or passions. It refined them. It sharpened them into tools that could be used for purposes larger than her own comfort. When God's desires become your desires, even the way you pursue your gifts changes. Maybe you're naturally drawn to music or business or teaching or writing. Those callings don't disappear. Instead, they are placed back into God's hands, surrendered with an open heart. You begin to ask, how can this reflect your character and your love, not just my skill? The result is that the work of your hands starts to carry a weight that goes beyond the here and now. It becomes a vessel through which eternal truth can flow into temporary moments. And this doesn't just happen in grand, visible ways. It happens in the quiet, unseen faithfulness of showing up with integrity, serving when no one claps, and creating without demanding recognition. Your relationships begin to bear the marks of this transformation as well. You find less pleasure in conversations that revolve around gossip or complaint. Even if you once found them entertaining, they now leave a sour taste in your spirit. A harsh word spoken in anger doesn't feel as satisfying as it once might have. Instead, it lingers in your conscience like a stone in your shoe. Where you used to be quick to dismiss or judge, you find your heart bending toward compassion. This is not because you've suddenly become more tolerant in the shallow sense, but because you've started to see people through God's eyes. And once that happens, it's almost impossible to return to the narrow lens of self-interest. You begin to care about the things He cares about: mercy, justice, truth, humility, and you grieve over the things that grieve Him. I remember a man in his 70s who had spent most of his life chasing his own ambitions. He admitted to me, without self-pity, but with a sober honesty, that he had been living entirely for himself for decades. It was only late in life, after surrendering to Christ, that his priorities began to change. "I don't regret the things I missed out on," he said. "I regret not caring sooner about what God cares about." After that, he began volunteering with at-risk youth, not as a charity project, but because he genuinely wanted to show them the kind of love he had never received in his own childhood. His desires had shifted from personal comfort to participating in redemption. That kind of change cannot be faked, and it cannot be rushed. It's the fruit of letting God's heart slowly reshape your own. Even the way you pray begins to evolve in this season. The long lists of requests you use to present to God start to feel less urgent, not because your needs have disappeared, but because you trust Him more with the outcome. You stop praying primarily for the fulfillment of your personal plans and start asking Him to shape your will to match His. You begin to mean it when you say, "Lord, I want your purposes more than my preferences." Sometimes that means loosening your grip on dreams that once defined you. Other times, it means staying put in a place you once begged God to help you leave. And strangely, the more you surrender, the lighter your soul feels, as if the weight you've been carrying was never yours to hold in the first place. This surrender changes your definition of a blessed life. You stop measuring blessings solely by what you've accumulated or achieved. Instead, you measure it by how closely your steps align with God's path. A quiet, unremarkable day spent in faithfulness can become more satisfying than a day filled with busyness and applause. You discover beauty in simplicity, strength in waiting, joy in obedience. Your soul is no longer addicted to emotional highs or constant stimulation. It begins to rest in the steady rhythm of God's presence. You also start noticing people differently. The lonely no longer blend into the background. They stand out to you like beacons calling for kindness. Injustice doesn't just make you uncomfortable, it moves you to compassion and, when possible, to action. You find yourself praying for people you once overlooked, and not because someone reminded you to, but because something inside you aches with the same longing God has for them. His burdens become your burdens, and His joy becomes your joy. This shift is not about behavior modification or image management. It's not about looking more spiritual or checking off a list of religious duties. It's about the Spirit of God doing quiet, steady work deep inside you, pruning distractions, deepening what's eternal, and reshaping your inner life until your desires begin pointing away from your own kingdom and toward His. It is a process, and some days you will feel it more strongly than others. But over time, the pull of the old life weakens, and the gravitational center of your heart moves closer and closer to God's. When this happens, when you start desiring what God desires, life no longer feels like a scramble for advantage or a competition for recognition. It begins to feel like a calling, a journey you get to walk with purpose and peace. And in that calling, you find a joy that circumstances cannot touch, a joy that is anchored not in what you possess or accomplish, but in the one who holds your heart. The next transformation that comes when God is first is one of perspective, and it is perhaps the most freeing of all. You begin to live with eternity in mind. At first, it's almost like putting on a second pair of glasses, not glasses that distort reality, but ones that clarify what truly matters. The events of your day, the challenges you face, the decisions you weigh, they are all still real and urgent, but now you see them against the backdrop of forever. You begin to ask different questions. Instead of, what will make me happiest right now? You find yourself asking, what will matter most in the light of eternity? And once you start viewing life this way, you can't go back to the small, short-term calculations that once dominated your thinking. When the reality of eternity begins to settle into your vision, it doesn't turn you into someone detached from life's present moments. Quite the opposite. It sharpens your sense of what matters now because you see everything in light of what will last forever. You begin to weigh your choices differently. Words you once tossed around casually now feel weightier because you've come to understand that every sentence, whether it builds up or tears down, leaves an imprint. Your responses to conflict change as well. Where once you might have held on to grudges, convinced you were justified in your resentment, you now see unforgiveness for what it really is, a burden that corrodes the soul and steals your freedom. You forgive more quickly, not because the hurt was small or insignificant, but because eternity has taught you that bitterness costs far more than it's worth. I think often of a retired missionary couple I once heard about who had spent over 3 decades serving in a remote region of Africa. They gave up comfort, financial stability, and the applause of their peers to pour their lives into people who at first could offer nothing in return. When they finally returned to the United States, it happened to be on the same flight as a famous political figure. As they stepped off the plane, they watched the politician receive a hero's welcome. Crowds cheering, cameras flashing, banners waving. For them, there was no welcome party, no fanfare, no applause. The husband admitted feeling a twinge of disappointment until his wife leaned toward him and whispered a sentence that carried the weight of eternity. "We're not home yet." That simple truth reframed everything, because When you live with eternity in mind, you stop expecting this world to be your source of validation. You understand that the truest rewards are not handed out here. This life is not the finish line, it's the planting ground. Living with eternity in your heart doesn't make you careless about the present. It makes you more intentional than ever. You begin to value people over possessions, conversations over accomplishments, depth over display. You see your work, your home, and even your hobbies as temporary but sacred vessels, tools that can carry the love of Christ into spaces where it's desperately needed. You stop obsessing over how to get ahead and start thinking more about what you're leaving behind. But it's not the legacy of fame or reputation you seek. It's the quiet, enduring legacy of faith, the kind that will ripple long after your name is forgotten. This eternal lens also loosens your grip on control. You realize you are not the author of the story. You're a single page in a much larger narrative written by a far greater hand. And because you're not in charge of the ending, you can live with a little more surrender. You can trust that even the unseen acts, the kindness no one noticed, the prayer no one heard, the obedience that cost you dearly, are all seen and valued by the one who matters most. This changes the way you endure hardship. Pain no longer feels like a cosmic mistake or an arbitrary punishment. Instead, you begin to see it as preparation. Trials that once made you question God's goodness now make you lean into His presence with greater desperation and trust. You stop asking only, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "How is God shaping me through this?" Some might accuse people who live this way of being too heavenly minded to be any earthly good. But in reality, it's the opposite. Those who live with eternity burning in their hearts tend to love the most generously, serve the most faithfully, and persevere the most quietly. They are anchored not in the shifting tides of this world, but in the unshakable reality of the next. And when your eyes are fixed there, aging no longer frightens you, and death no longer looms as a shadow to dread. Instead, you see the finish of this life as the doorway to the truest home you've ever known. Every act of faithfulness here will echo in a kingdom without end. This shift in perspective also changes your relationship with time itself. When God is first, you start to see that He is never in a hurry, and yet He is never late. At first, that truth can be frustrating. You pray for healing, and it doesn't come right away. You work faithfully and honestly, yet the breakthrough you hoped for remains elusive. Doors you thought would swing wide stay stubbornly shut. In those seasons, it's tempting to assume God is withholding something or that He's distant from your struggle. But as your faith deepens, you begin to see delays differently. They're not necessarily denials. They're often divine development. This is one of the hardest but most beautiful lessons you learn when God takes His rightful place. Waiting is not wasted time. Waiting seasons are shaping seasons. They are the places where God forms something in you before He works something through you. I've heard countless people look back on seasons they once resented only to say, "If God had given me what I asked for when I asked for it, I wouldn't have been ready to carry it." That kind of perspective doesn't come cheaply. It's forged in the long nights when you have no choice but to cling to His promises and trust His heart. The more you learn to trust God's timing, the more you release your need to compare your life to someone else's. You stop asking, "Why not me?" and start praying, "Lord, make me ready for what you have in mind." You understand that a blessing given too soon can become a burden, and so you stop trying to outrun his pace. This doesn't make waiting effortless, but it does make it holy. You start to see the wisdom in verses like Ecclesiastes 3:11. He has made everything beautiful in its time, not yours, his. And when you've experienced his timing enough times, you come to trust that even in the silence, he's working, not just on the outcome, but on your soul. And then there's the unexpected byproduct of a life where God is first, one that others notice before you do. You become a channel of his peace. It's not something you set out to manufacture. It happens as a natural overflow of your connection to him. Without realizing it, you carry something into the spaces you enter. People might not know what changed in you or when it happened, but they sense it. You respond instead of reacting. You pause instead of panicking. You listen instead of rushing to speak. Your very presence begins to act as a steadying force in the chaos of other people's lives. I once visited an older couple who embodied this so deeply that it was almost tangible. They didn't talk about peace as much as they simply carried it. Their home was not filled with religious slogans plastered on every wall, nor did they put on a show of spirituality. But the moment you walked through their door, a calm settled over you. Years of walking closely with God had rooted them in a way that no storm could uproot. That kind of peace doesn't come from personality type or natural temperament. It is the fruit of the Spirit, born from staying near the one who is peace. When you live this way, your words change too. You stop speaking to impress and start speaking to bless. You don't feel the same need to dominate conversations. Instead, you leave room for others to breathe. You become less interested in winning arguments and more interested in honoring Christ in your responses. And this steady, non-anxious presence you carry often opens doors for deeper connection. People feel safe enough to be honest around you, not because you promise them solutions, but because your peace gives them space to rest. This, in the end, is the legacy of putting God first. It's not just that your life is changed. It's that your life becomes an instrument through which God changes the atmosphere for others. You stop walking into rooms looking for attention, and you start walking into rooms carrying the presence of Christ. You become the kind of person whose quiet trust in God becomes contagious, whose faithfulness stirs faith in others, and whose peace acts like a refuge in the storms they face. And here is the most beautiful truth of all. None of this happens because you've mastered life or figured out some hidden formula. It happens because you've surrendered day after day, choice after choice, to let God take his rightful place. When you truly put him first, your priorities realign, your desires shift, your vision stretches into eternity, your trust in his timing deepens, and your life overflows with peace that is not your own. You stop striving for control and start living with an open hand. You stop chasing recognition and start seeking faithfulness. And in the process, without fanfare, you become living proof of what it means for a soul to be anchored in God.